Good evening, and welcome to this moderated webinar panel discussion on the intersection of traditional African cultures and practices, religion, and homophobia in Africa. My name is Kutlwano Pearl Magashula. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm the Executive Officer for Program Functions at the Other Foundation. The Other Foundation is very excited to be co-convening this webinar with Mark Gevisser, whose latest book, The Pink Line, will anchor the discussions here today and serve as an analytical lens to explore the themes further. For the benefit of those who are unfamiliar with the work of the Other Foundation, the Other Foundation is a Southern African regional community foundation that supports the protection and advancement of the human rights of LGBTI persons in 13 Southern African countries, with a particular focus on human rights related to sexual orientation and gender identity. From the time that the foundation became operational at the beginning of 2015, it has been invested in the expansion of strategic innovation in LGBTI activism to areas that have not been adequately developed in Southern Africa, including religion, tradition and culture, business, and parents of LGBTI persons, amongst other areas. We have learned through this work that sustained systemic progress towards equality and freedom for LGBTI persons in the region requires more joined up, strategic, and hard hitting public advocacy capability by LGBTI human rights activists, as well as more robust direct engagement with duty bearers in the public, private, and social spheres for deep change in policies and attitudes. So, simply put, we need stronger networks amongst LGBTI activists and allies in religious organizations, in government, within cultural and traditional leadership, and other areas of social influence. This will not only advance the agenda, but will increase preventive security because broad-based networks form a good protection and support system. In addition, we all know that the main backlash narratives against LGBTI persons are informed by social institutions such as religious organizations, traditional cultural leaders, the mass media, and public policymakers. But these groups have not been adequately engaged by LGBTI activists in Southern Africa. Conversations like the one we'll have today present an extraordinary opportunity for all of us to collectively galvanize our advocacy strategies in this regard and shift narratives around LGBTI people and the church and spirituality. I can guarantee, just judging from my esteemed panel, that today we'll receive unique insights and reflections on religion and culture's role in driving a homophobic agenda in the region. But more importantly, the sharing of strategies for more effective engagement to create more inclusive and affirming environments, drawing on traditions of liberation, Black theology, as well as African ancestry and indigenous knowledge from seasoned activists and experts in their areas of operation. So just to introduce our panel today, we'll be joined by the following panelists. We'll be joined by Dr. Fikile Vilakazi, who is an LGBTI activist and traditional healer. Will you please wave? Thank you. We'll also be joined by Dr. Jessica Bwila, who's a lecturer and former Malawi Member of Parliament. She just put on her video. Thank you, Jessie. We'll also be joined today by Tony Kruger Ayebazibwe, who's an LGBTI activist and lay minister in the Anglican Church, and Tony has just waved. We'll also be joined by Professor Samadoda Figeni, who's a public policy expert and political analyst. Thank you, Prof. And finally, we'll be joined by Mark Gevisser, who is our moderator today and who's author of The Pink Line, Journeys Across the World's Queer Frontiers. I will now hand over to Mark. Thank you. Mark, your mic is off.
Thank you so much, Kutlwano. It's as always, a real pleasure working with the Other Foundation that has been so powerful in creating precisely those networks that Kutlwano was talking about, and we see the fruits of it in this amazing event today, attended by so many of you, and with such illustrious panelists in conversation with me about my new book, which is called, or the ideas of my new book, which is called The Pink Line: Journeys Across the World's Queer Frontiers. We've invited these panelists to share their wisdom and experience about what the pink line might mean for them in their lives and in their work, and I'll describe the pink line in a minute. I'm going to talk a little bit about the framing concept of my work and my book. I'm then going to ask each of the panelists to address a component of the discussion we're having now, unpacking the way politics, culture, and religion intersect in our region when it comes to promoting homophobic laws and practices on the one hand, and a culture of human rights and diversity on the other. There'll also be time towards the end of this webinar for you who are listening to it to join us with questions. If you would like to ask questions, you can submit your questions at any point during our conversation using only the Q&A function, not the chat function, using the Q&A function, and I will then be able to put the questions to the panelists when we come to the Q&A session. We are going to end in just over an hour's time, in an hour and 15 minutes time. I also want to say to all of the panelists, they've all been introduced, I do have individual questions for all of them, but I'm really happy for this to be a fluid and open discussion. It's one of the benefits of this webinar format. And please feel free to jump in and ask each other questions or me questions at any time along the way. So I came up with the idea of this book, The Pink Line, in 2009, when I looked at two events that happened in our region. And one was an event that happened to me. It was actually the same-sex marriage to my partner, which had been something possible in South Africa since 2006. As you all know, South Africa is famously, on paper at least, very progressive when it comes to LGBTI rights. We were the first constitution in the world to explicitly outlaw discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. We were only the 5th country in the world to permit same-sex marriage. Now, we're going to talk a little bit later about the huge gap that exists in our country between law and policy on the one hand and practice on the other. But that was my reality. And the reason why I did it is because my partner, who was then going to become my husband, had been offered a job in Paris with the United Nations. And if I was married to him, I could go with him. I could get all the benefits that any heterosexual couple could get, the spousal grants, the whole thing. How wonderful, I thought. In that very same year, I was really struck by something that was happening in another part of our region, and Jesse Kabwila, one of our panelists, is from that very country, Malawi, where a couple named Tibonga Chimbalanga and Stephen Monjeza held an engagement ceremony, which in traditional Chichewa culture is known as a Chinkoswe. And this was held publicly. And as a result of this engagement ceremony, these two people, who were both presumed by the law in Malawi to be male, even though one identifies as female, received, unlike me, who received a ticket to Paris, this couple received a prosecution under the Malawian law, which forbids so-called carnal knowledge against the order of nature. They were subject to the most humiliating and degrading trial. They were sentenced to 14 years hard labor by the Malawian Supreme Court. And they were finally released after a global solidarity campaign that even had the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, flying into Malawi on a mercy mission. Once they were released, the couple split up, not surprisingly, given all that pressure. And Tibonga Chimbalanga actually sought asylum in South Africa and received asylum on the basis of feared persecution due to her gender identity in South Africa. She now lives in Cape Town, very close to where I live, because I also live in Cape Town. And as I was thinking about these two events, my marriage and Tibonga's marriage, and as she and I began talking about it, because we got to know each other, I realized that there was some sort of pink line, as I call it, that was being drawn across the world, a new geopolitical frontier, a new human rights frontier that was dividing and describing the world in a way that was unimaginable to me when I came out in the 1980s, that was probably unimaginable to many of the people on this panel. A new global conversation was happening about sexual orientation and gender identity, not just in so-called progressive and enlightened parts of the world, but globally. And the purpose of my book is to track what has happened as a consequence of this new global conversation about sexual orientation and gender identity, that is forcing societies all over the world to look differently at who can be considered a citizen and who cannot be considered a citizen, as who has dignity and who doesn't have dignity, as what constitutes a family, as what constitutes love, as what constitutes an identity itself. Because as we'll discuss, the pink line not only runs between countries, perhaps we might argue at the time of Tiwonga and Stephen's sentencing between Malawi and South Africa, but it runs through countries too. And we know that in South Africa, because we know about the intense transphobia and homophobia that still exists in this society. It runs through families too. It runs through communities too. It runs very importantly in this digital age between the kind of freedom you can have if you just have a cell phone and a little bit of bandwidth and some privacy, and you can log on to a global network, a global identity, to ideas and information and community online. But when you look up from that cell phone, you kind of cross a pink line as you look into the eyes, perhaps, of a disapproving parent, or of a faith community that says you're a sinner, or of a state that says that what you are doing is illegal. And what was fascinating to me in doing this research was coming to understand how we all, those of us who consider ourselves to be part of the LGBTI community, or queer as I call it, we all cross these pink lines all the time in our lives. We all have to negotiate what it means to live in this pink line space between being accepted and celebrated by some people in some parts of the world fully, but being denigrated too. And so much of the pink line politics have been about, as we're going to talk about, and as Kutwana has also already said, a kind of backlash that has happened in some societies against this new set of rights that a new group of people, allegedly new group of people, are claiming within civil society. So that's the broad frame of my ideas. And before I put specific questions to our panelists, I thought I would invite them one by one, just to say a few words personally about what the pink line means for them, what their associations are to the concept of the pink line, and how they feel they might have had to negotiate the pink line or cross it in their own lives or in their own work, or perhaps how they've seen others negotiating this line if they're not LGBTI themselves. And so I'd like to ask all our panelists to unmute and to begin with you, Vikile, to ask you about what the pink line means for you.
Thank you very much, Mark, and to everyone that is attended. The pink line comes at a time that is very, very volatile for the African continent, Mark, when it comes to issues of homosexuality, particularly because we continue to see a trend where, on the one hand, homosexuality continues to be demonized, for lack of a better word, in various parts of the world, particularly also the African continent. Whilst at the same time, we are seeing other countries within the African continent who are beginning to also decriminalize homosexuality. So there's that thing called a line that is happening. Some people call it a thin line. You are beautifully calling it a pink line. So that is what pink line means to us. It is a reminder that it is not yet Uhuru. It is a reminder that we are caught up we are caught up in a situation, we are in a trap of some kind that seems to be perpetual even as it seems to be liberating. So there is that dance, there is that relationship of freedom and not. And I think the pink line, I haven't read all of it now, but I've read what has been shared with us, and I'm still reading because I think it's really an important contribution in the literature of homosexuality on the African continent. Reminds us that we cannot continue to be silent about what is happening on the African continent around the violences that are even as we see many countries lifting legislation, because what we also see at the same time is that the mindsets are not really changing. Why is it that when many countries are lifting pieces of legislation, then you still have other countries like Nigeria, for example, that are really being punitive about homosexuality and so on. So that's what the pink line is, and I'll stop there to give other panelists a chance to speak.
Thank you so much. There's something that there's a question you asked that I'm hoping we're going to answer. Why is it that while some countries are lifting restrictions, others are creating even more restrictions? So let's hold that question in mind as I go to you, Samadora, and ask you what the pink line means for you as a concept.
Well, to me, I think it's a very important contribution you have made. Again, congratulations, Mark. I've read some of your books extensively before, quite incisive, and this one was no different, except that it explores a very important subject that many people have not grappled with systematically as you have done. Let me go back. Growing up in a village in the Eastern Cape, we knew as we were growing up in the African traditional setting that certain people were of a different sexual orientation, except that it was not something much talked about. But they were given the space even within that African traditional setting. Then I got a scholarship to go to Canada in 1989 to do my master's. There I became part of the anti-apartheid committee, and I realized how significant this particular community of queers participated in that. Initially, I wasn't so sure how to relate, being heterosexual, and I realized how normal, how accessible, how creative this group of people was. Within no time, we were just visiting even the cafes and the bars which were dedicated to this community. And there was absolutely nothing thereafter except the prejudice or the presumptions or stereotypes one had. So ever since, I then realized how sometimes not interfacing with some of these communities can create perceptions. But the second part I want to say, what we're seeing right now is often, very often, a distortion of an African custom and tradition, where people try to revamp the African tradition, which may have been somewhat more open to many things. Just like some communities, you don't hear a lot about communities that were run by women as regents or as heads of their political institutions, because the maleness in his story and the masculinity is what is dominant in the mainstream literature. But more importantly, at this moment in time, you do have populism, geopolitical volatility, as well as the resurgence of identity politics, which I think is a reaction to the failure of globalization to be inclusive. So right across, whether you talk of America, where right now there is even a talk of reversing some of the important judgments in the US Supreme Court because of wave of neoconservatism. So that in itself is a key issue. And lastly, I want to say in South Africa and other countries which are even opening up to have a more liberal constitution, there is still a gap between what the constitution is intended to do and the behavior. As we have seen the gruesome murder of some of queer people in the townships merely because they happen to be of a different sexual orientation and nothing else. So that gap between what the Constitution promises and what human behavior at a local level is one of the key things that needs exploration. I would have gone to the mass media in the digital mass communication and how it creates both opportunities, but also the vile backlash that you see. Thank you.
Samadoda, thank you so much for that. I'm so struck by what you said, and we're going to return to it as well, about how when you were growing up in the Eastern Cape, people who were of a different sexual orientation were given space. And one of the questions I'm going to ask to all the panelists to consider when I come back to you is, what happened to that space? Why did that space get lost? Why was that space no longer there? Why did that space need to be fought for in a different way later? I'm also struck by what you said about the revamping of African tradition and the way African tradition has been revamped to be homophobic by some people. I want us to look at that too. And finally, I'm going to ask you to come back to your analysis of how so much of this homophobic populist politics is as a consequence of a failure of globalization to be inclusive. So we'll come back to that in the next round. Jesse, I'm going to come to you now and ask you, from your perspective in Malawi, I believe that's where you are, what the pink line means for you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you so much, Jesse.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I've been removing the video because the sound gets better when I remove the video. So excuse me, that's why I keep switching on and off. Yeah. But I hope now everybody can see me and hear me. For me here in Malawi, the pink line, I'll define it as the boundary, the formal boundary that actually is policed by the nation states jealously to make sure that we separate heterosexuals from LGBTI community, as if gender is a linear thing rather than a fluid thing. This is how I understand the pink line. I'm not sure whether I would call it a line because I think one thing that I've seen is it's not the pink line itself. I look at it more as pink shades because I think sometimes it's cyclic, sometimes it's not complete, sometimes it's not very clear. And I think a line tends to suggest a continuous thing, sometimes very pathological, because in my part of the world, most of the public homophobic people are actually homosexual or different from heterosexual, you know. So sometimes see the person implementing the line, not actually being, standing, so to speak. Yeah. So as I've being an academic, I'm very happy I've engaged in the book because I think the first thing I want to see is will this hold when he's talking about a line. And I think in terms of their big demarcation, I want to say it holds clearly. Where I would want to talk a lot about is whether it's a straight, linear thing or not. I think it is not. Malawi at the pink line has really been interesting because I think it has tested almost every demonstration, government system that has come. I wish I could call it republic, but I think the political changes we've had have times, I always get the feeling of the more things change, the more they stay the same, especially in terms of the homophobia, of course. So in terms of what is it, I think we've seen it, and it came very clear during the Tiwonge Jimbala issue. I think that helped bring the issue to the fore, and after that, a government promises itself. I'd say the Tiwonge Jimbala issue if we were to say where was the line pronounced, I could say during this Banda's time, the Tuonge Chimbalang issue, the straightness of the brightness of the way of the government to residents into the sexual discipline was very, very prominent. But when Dr. Joy came in, some of us who are in this discourse felt we had an oasis because we actually saw a moratorium being brought in, where because the Minister of Justice that was in at the time was very sensitive to LGBT issue, as a lawyer who actually understood that the pink line is not a legal and logical thing and correct thing, but he also knew he was dealing with a homophobic country that is seriously in need of decolonization in terms of them defining who they are. So he actually, and I must say, Dr. Joyce Banda could have a mistake, but I love the fact that even when her back was on the wall, she still decided to uphold the moratorium. It eroded a lot of her power. But from there, we have noticed that have stood for what is right rather than what is populist. So for me, I have seen in Malawi that the pink line is drawn more between the fight between the conservatives and those of us who are, I think not those of us on the left have not got into government, but maybe the liberals try to say no, do the right thing, and sometimes they come to the side of the left. I'm speaking this because I'm coming into this a politician who in parliament, but also the chance to represent the Women's Caucus, a feminist chairing the Women's Caucus at SADC. And what I saw is that the pink line there was, as I've said, it was not pronounced. It depended on what is happening and the pressures are in when we are moving motions. I also saw that the pink line has the pink line that is drawn, and then the other one that you are told about where there is relaxation rules, and you are told we'll move this motion as long as you remove it from the order paper, and we talk about it under the table, and to try and explain that the more LGBTI issues are cast under the table and are made arrangement, the more you are pushing people. So I think let's think of the pink line as lines that are drawn, some completely, some not completely, others in faint markers, others drawn in blood. Indeed, when we talk about the fact that there are some who are actually dying literally because the pink line is being drawn using their blood. You know.
Thank you so
I think my comment is. I think I'll stop there for now. So we can pick up the others from.
Thank you so much, Jesse. I found that invaluable, particularly your insistence on the pink line's mutability, and I couldn't agree with you more. That it's a line that shifts shape, that it's a line that can be disrupted, that it's a line in the sand rather than a firm line that is often written in blood, as you say. Just to make it clear to those who were listening. Jesse was talking about how Dr. Joyce Banda, who succeeded Bingu Mutharika as the Malawian president, declared a moratorium on the prosecution of LGBTI people using the legislation, the carnal knowledge against the order of nature. And as a result of that, she eroded a lot of power. That's what Jesse was talking about. And then Jesse was talking after that about the kind of negotiations that have happened in Malawi once the issue erupted, following the very high-profile arrest of Tuonga Chimbalanga and Stephen Monjeza. Tony, finally to you in this first round. As an activist, as a lay minister, as the executive director of the Global Interfaith Network, what does the pink line mean for you?
Thank you, Mark. And thank you for the opportunity to be here, really. I think this is going to be such a fascinating discussion. So I think for me, I mean, and this may be a function of how I think, as particularly a person to whom faith is very important, I seized upon the grounds on which that pink line is often drawn. And I am fully in agreement with Jessie that it's not linear. It's a mess. It shifts. But I seized upon the grounds on which that pink line is often drawn, and I think that very often the line is drawn on the basis of, on the one hand, there is this kind of global positive human rights. Yes, we're all for sexual and gender minority people. And on the other hand, is faith and tradition and culture and the kind of, often in many contexts around the world, the national sovereignty, this idea that a country, a nation state has a particular identity and that identity must remain fixed, monolithic, static. So I seized upon that aspect of the pink line. And for me, when I thought about it, I thought to myself, well, in fact, the pink line probably runs right down the middle of me, because I hold in myself, I embody both on the one hand faith and tradition, and on the other hand this kind of global universalist human rights perspective. As a person of faith and as a queer person, and I reject this opposition. I mean, I think there is a pink line. It's a reality. It's a pink, maybe not a line, or something or other, which divides between contexts where it's okay to be queer and other contexts where it isn't okay. But I reject the opposition because I don't believe that it's a true opposition. I think it's a shibboleth. I do not, for example, believe, I mean, and I think Somadoda has said it, I do not believe that traditional cultures or faith traditions anywhere in the world really are fundamentally exclusionary. I think that often we think of faith traditions or cultures as monolithic, as static, as remaining as they were at some point forever and ever, and it's just not true. I also don't believe that the kind of global universalist human rights perspective is the be-all and the end-all. It's very valuable, but I think that there are any number of actors who espouse that point of view, who have somehow taken on this idea that that point of view is better, higher, more enlightened than the rest of the world. And that the aim, therefore, becomes that we should all somehow move into that space. We should all become Western universalist human rights, and I don't think that that would be a good thing. I mean, yes, it would be very good if all of us could have safe lives and the freedom to do the things that we choose to do, but I don't think that that's the only strategy to get there. And as you said in your author's note, there isn't only one way to be in the world. And that I hold on to that. I think there are multiple ways to be in the world, and I think that there are multiple healthy, wonderful, flourishing ways to be in the world.
Thank you so much, Tony. I'm gonna stop you there. That's very powerful, and I want to underscore something you said, and that we're going to interrogate as well, which is your absolute conviction that faith traditions are not fundamentally exclusive. So one of the things I want us to begin talking about is how it came to be on this continent, in this time and in this place, that a certain kind of exclusivism became the preserve of a right-wing Christian, because the major religion in our part of the world is Christian. We could speak about Islam too, but let's stick with Christian, has become the preserve of a right-wing Christian political agenda. So Jessie would be able to tell us that at the forefront of the Pink Line warriors in Malawi were Christian politicians trying to exhibit their good faith by attacking queer people. So let's try and understand what has happened, if indeed faith traditions are not fundamentally exclusive. And perhaps we can begin this process by just going back to what Samadora said that was so powerful about how in the Eastern Cape where he was grown up, he saw people of different sexual orientations given space. And Fikile, I want to come back to you because you are a scholar of indigenous knowledge systems. And I want to ask you, what is it? What can we say about the way African societies, traditional African societies, indigenous African societies deal with difference and non-normativity when it comes to sexual orientation and gender identity? Unmute, Fikile.
Thank you very much, Mark. I want to start by saying that I speak as a peer person who is also a Sangoma, which is what people commonly call traditional healers in South Africa. So I speak from that subjective place as well, which is very, very important because it is embedded in who then I am within who we all are. Because when we talk about Lungoma, when we talk about the healing practices that we embody, they unveil a lot of things about our ancestry. I speak as a generation of. And it's very important to start from that place, Mark, and then link to the scholarly components that make all parts of who I am. To say that we are all generations of some people who were here before. We did not fall from the sky. And that means that we walk in the traits, in the footsteps and the footprints of our grandmothers, our grandfathers, our forefathers, our forebearers, our forebeings. And we carry this in ourselves and in our genes and in our bodies and in our spirits. And it can therefore not be fragmented from who we are. Sexuality is a small component of who we are. We are spiritual beings that live in a human experience, and that human experience is sexualized also, and it is gendered by constructs. And like Tony puts it, constructs are things that we create as people. They are not linear, they are not firm, they constantly change with time and evolution, and so on. So I want to come back then to the question of African scholarship around this question. There's a lot that has been written, Mark and fellow colleagues, on this subject matter. I can name a number of authors, but I would like to just speak about Professor Umsibi, for example, from where I come from, the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Stephen Murray has written about this. Professor Sylvia Tamale has written. Many of us who are also here have written aspects of the story. But just to say that there are a number of examples that exist on the African continent around same-sex sexual activities, way back from the 1500s, from the 1400s, even the 1600s. A number of scholars document these experiences. For example, we've got Abonzinga, the warrior woman in the Ndongo kingdom of the Mbulu, who ruled as a king rather than as a queen. What we would know in these days as queen regents. And I think the Professor Samadora touched a little bit on that.
I'm going to interrupt for a minute. Would you say, given what you've just said, that the first people to draw a pink line across Africa were the Christian colonial missionaries? I mean, I'm asking a provocative question. Is it correct to say that prior to colonization, there was not a separating out of them on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, and that the Bible and the law book coming from Britain did that? Would you say that that's correct?
I would say that homophobia is an invasion. It is a system of oppression that was imposed on a people who were living in a certain way freely, like Professor Somatodemi puts it very well. We have always practiced who we are, including our sexual diversities and our sexual ways of being. And it has always been acceptable, particularly if you speak in the context of Africa. What has been imposed on us is a system of oppression that is called homophobia, hatred of difference, hatred of different ways of being sexual, and one of those being the hatred of being what we call LGBTIQ people. We do not even know these names, but we have always been.
Okay, so this is a question to both Fikile and Samadoda, because Samadoda, I'm so interested in your own lived experience of queer people being given space. An important writer on LGBTI politics, Rahul Rao, has just written a book called Out of Time, in which he acknowledges what we've just said, that it was colonialism that brought the kind of legislation of homophobia into African society. But he also says that we must be careful not to practice what he calls Afro-Romanticism, because there are certain norms in African traditions as well that require, for example, the bloodlines to continue, that require marriage to happen, that require men to couple with women to make children, even if men and women are allowed to recognize libidinal desires elsewhere. So I'm interested in asking you, Samadoda, first how you saw the space that was given to queer people in your home culture, but also perhaps, frankly, what the limitations of that space were.
Well, I do think that I was in a deep rural area of Lugelweni. And it so happened that one of our neighbors came back from Johannesburg with his male partner, and he was also male himself. So our parents were trying to explain this, that no, this has always been the case. We must respect them. And that is what they've chosen to do. And they would walk around the village and so forth, go drinking and so on. There was not that much of an issue, but as you correctly say, I wouldn't romanticize it, because the culture was mainly preferring heterosexual, even in the talk, to say, when you get married to a woman, when we have children, when you maintain our patrilineal line. So it was very clear. But what was different then is that no one would go out attacking them, ostracizing them, ill-treating them, and so forth. They were just accepted as being different. But the dominant value system was our prayers, our wishes is when you get married to a person of opposite sex. So that was the essence of it, that spaces were created, but they didn't go further to say, let's celebrate this diversity, or let's, give them spaces. And I'm sure if they had wanted to ascend to certain positions, that would be a hindrance to them. But traditionally, as my colleague is saying, you do find some of these stories of very powerful people who otherwise had a different orientation. And that was not that much of an issue, but it was still a patriarchal system that they presided on. But when Christianity came in, it came to reinforce and reinterpret tradition in a manner that brought the West out of it. Similarly, when, colonial administrations, which had little understanding of some nuances of the tradition, they came in, said, head of the family, head of the tribe is a man, whereas other customs were a lot more complex than that. Thank you.
So that's very interesting, and clearly, I think we could agree that one of the villains the main villain in terms of painting the pink line is a particular application of the Christian faith that you're describing. But I want to ask something quite provocative, and particularly to you, Fikile, given that you have also been such a prominent lesbian activist in South Africa. Could we say that another culprit, even with the best of intentions, and even though we agree with it, is the LGBTI movement itself? And the reason why I say that, let me explain that, my question before you jump on it, which is that could we say that in the past, certain non-normative sexualities and gender identities were allowed, so long as they didn't claim any particular rights or space from the patriarchy. But that perhaps what has happened in the last generation or two is and this is certainly a story in South Africa, is that younger people have, and particularly given post-democracy and post the Constitution, have been claiming space, have been saying, you know, I'm not content just to keep my libidinal desires on the side and marry and have children, marry a man and have children if I don't want to. I'm not content to cover my head and wear a dress if actually the way I want to express myself is with a chiscorp and in jeans. And the way I want to express myself is by living with a woman, not a man. So that there's a challenge as people claim their rights, according to these universal rights that Tony was speaking about. There's a challenge that's being given to the patriarchy. And it's almost as a backlash that some space that was there before that was perhaps compromised, but there has now perhaps been taken away. Do you think there's any truth to that argument, Fikile? And then I will go on and ask Tony what she thinks of that.
I'm trying to understand actually the question, whether the question is about patriarchy itself being a problem that is being challenged, and perhaps that also challenging the arrangements of the internal organizing of the LGBTI movement.
My question, sorry to interrupt again. My question is more specifically about a certain disruption that's happened as younger people such as yourself have stood up and said, you know, we're not willing to do this on the down low anymore. We have rights and we're going to claim our rights in our societies, on our streets. And that is claiming a certain civic space that is profoundly dangerous and threatening to the patriarchy when women, as far as the patriarchy sees it, begin to behave like men. And I say that in inverted commas.
No, I hear you, Mark. I hear you very, very well. You actually remind me of so many stories, and I can only refer to the experience of the Coalition of African Lesbians, in particular amongst many others, because the Coalition of African Lesbians still remains one such coalition on the African continent that has done exactly that, to say that we are not going to be silenced as African lesbian women on the African continent. We exist everywhere in the 53 countries of the continent. And we did that. We fought from our homes, right into our doorsteps, into our streets. And we were rejected, and some of us have died. And we have lost comrades and sisters along the way. We have taken the matter to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Well, we asked Mark exactly what you are saying, to say, why don't you just remove the word lesbian from this thing? Call yourself ladies or women, you know, and so on. But we say we can't do that. That is not who we are. We would like to claim the language, because language is culture, language is power, language determines. And of course, then language is embedded in a particular system of being, which is patriarchal in this particular case. And the case continues, as we all know the story, that the application of the Coalition of African Lesbians was eventually granted by the African Commission, but the African Union made the African Commission on Human and People's Rights to withdraw that decision. And as we speak, the matter is at the level of the African Court on Human and People's Rights and the African Court on of Justice. So that is exactly what we have done. And we will continue to do that, to say we exist in Africa, we are African, we are lesbians, we are queer, we are who we are, with the right to be. And we will take it to the highest court of the world even, so that even the world can understand that homosexuality is not a borrowed way of being from the West. It is not. Actually, what is oppression is homophobia, and we need to then shape the narrative ourselves and say we are here and we exist in these ways, and the world must know, even the former oppressors of Africa who actually narrated our story, as we reclaim who we are. And somebody was asking a question also in the people, say, how do we then contest these inventions? We need to be able to do it in ways where we remember who we are, because we're dismembered. Like Mukiwationg says, oppressions have come and they've fragmented us, they dismembered us. But the way to do it is to constantly be mindful, because it is the colonization of the mind. The mind has been told that you are not this. A particular narrative has been set. Titi Dangaremba talk about this also in the experiences of Zimbabweans. Recently, she was arrested contesting the very same issues, to say that there are certain narratives that are imposed in our minds. So we need medicine for our minds, and that medicine is narrative. It is resistance, and we need to continue to resist through narrative and through occupation of space, and insisting of the language that we are, and one of that is insisting the fact that we appear in Palestinians and we are Africans and we are here.
Narrative is a tool in our hands, but also in the oppressor's hands. And I'm really interested to understand how one African narrative came to be that homosexuality is un-African, and how that narrative came to be using Christianity. And I wonder, I'm very, very sorry we've lost Jessie. She had a poor connection and I think she's been bumped off, because I would have loved to hear how this played out in Malawi. But I'm going to ask you, Tony, and then come back to you, Somadoda, to speak about how given everything that Samadora and Fikile have said, a particular narrative about homosexuality has rooted in African politics. How and why? So to you first, Tony.
So, I mean, I think that there are many answers to that question. I think that there are a wide range of factors that have played into this state of affairs, and colonial history is one of them, certainly. I think that what we see a lot on the continent at the moment is a kind of political homophobia, a homophobia which uses queer people as scapegoats to achieve political ends. And I think what is interesting for me is why, for example, we don't see queer people used as political scapegoats in this country, in South Africa. We see foreigners, particularly foreigners from the rest of the continent, used as scapegoats here all the time. I mean, Herman Mashaba, all of that stuff. But we don't see queer people used as scapegoats here. And the question is why? And for me, the answer has to do with the fact that our constitution protects sexual orientation as one of the grounds, but also the cultural evolution that has happened as a result of the fact that we have that constitution, and as a result of the work that people did on the basis of that constitution. So in South Africa, using LGBT people as political scapegoats doesn't work. It's kind of regarded
Tony,
as less.
I'm going to interrupt for a second, because I think you're making such an important point. Do you mind? I want to ask you whether you think that one of the reasons why it doesn't work in South Africa is precisely because of the tradition of liberation theology in South Africa, and because we have had leaders like Bishop Tutu who have not allowed Christianity to be used in that way, the way Archbishop Akinola has used it in Nigeria, or the Anglican Church has used it in Uganda or Malawi. Doesn't it have to do with the role that the church played in the anti-apartheid struggle, that we have not had that particular coupling in South Africa?
No, I think you may very well be right. I mean, what we have in South Africa, part of the kind of theological underpinnings of the apartheid struggle was black theology, which I think Somadoda might know a lot about. Whereas on most of the rest of the continent, what we have is African theology. And the black theology is much more framed around a liberation theology, around the idea that you start with the people who are suffering the consequence. You start with the people at the bottom of the pile, and then you work your way up instead of working from the other way, from the top down, so to speak. So I think that is part of it. I also think that political scapegoating chooses its targets depending on who is vulnerable in a particular society, which is why here it's foreigners and not queer people, and in Kenya it's queer people, or in Nigeria it's queer people, because they don't have the same history, and it's no doubt partly a theological history, but they don't have the same history, and so those people are vulnerable, and so they make good scapegoats. And the point about political homophobia is that I think that it's convenient. I don't think that it is, in many ways, I don't think it's a real reflection of the religious convictions of the people who are doing it. I think that they use it as a tool.
Thank you, Tony. Somodora, I'm going to come to you in a minute, but we have Jesse back with us, and I'm going to ask you, as somebody who comes from a place where political homophobia has been used in the name of Christianity, do you see the right wing using homophobia towards a particular end politically? In other words, are homosexuals and queer people and transgender people scapegoated in a particular way in Malawi towards a particular end that really might have little to do with what people actually think about queer people? Or do you think the homophobia reflects a sort of a deep-rooted Christianity? And if we can ask you to unmute yourself, Jesse.
All right. Thank you. Can you hear now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to start by a conversation when I dropped off. You were who drew the line. The discussion was, is it on your thing or not? I think I need to just put input into that. For me, I think there's too much power given to colonialism. I agree fully that exacerbated the issue. But I think it just found fertile ground of indigenous patriarchy. For me, homophobia is a product of power relations. The same power relations that oppressed feminists are the ones that visit on LGBTI. So to me, heteropatriarchy that is constructed by the media, by the movie, by the education, the colonial education, colonial legal system. But all of these, it's because they found, we've got a word in Chichewa, chonde, means like fertilizer, a fertilized ground. So I just wanted to pig in the fact that if somebody said who drew the pink line, I would say we ourselves need to take ownership that as Africans, we do have homophobic cultures, and we perpetuate this. But then Christianity, Islam, the organized religion, organized legal systems, frameworks, and name them, really partnered very well with this. Now, coming to the question, which unfortunately, which you've just asked, I ended up, because I'm really having problems with connectivity. Could you just please, in short, summarize what you're asking, because I didn't.
Do you believe that homophobia by Malawian politicians is a way of using or fanning the flames of hatred towards a minority for other reasons? In other words, as a way of getting votes, as a way of showing that you protect law and order, as a way of diverting attention from the fact that you're a corrupt or useless failed state administration. What role does homophobia, political homophobia, play in Malawi? Why is it prosecuted so vigorously?
Going to have to ask you because I was just getting snipped. All I had was, do you think homophobia, and then blah blah blah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So
I'm sorry.
So ever, maybe let me leave you to move. You can, because I want to put you having a time. Yeah. So honestly, I didn't get the gist. Unfortunately, it sounds like a very cogent question asking on the systemic causes of this. But what I'm doing here is guessing. I didn't get. I didn't the question. The question is very.
Let me ask the question to you, Somodora, then. Why is it that that political actors would pick up homophobia as a strategy, and what are the roots of this, and how can it be in the context we've just been describing, the African context? What are the ways of fighting it politically?
Well, I do think that the first thing that is happening is that people look for the most vulnerable, especially when also you do not have independent judiciary. And they mobilize around that by reconstructing our primordial identities or cultures and then presenting them in the puritanical sense without critically observing or understanding what that history was. They present it as a fact. I'll just use the example of women where they say in the African culture, the place of a woman is in the kitchen. In some instances, you hear some people saying that. And yet, historically, you find that the place of a woman was always in many other places, including, as my colleague was saying, the one of rulership. The reason in South Africa it might be the case that we are not necessarily having that as a problem. One, you have one of the most diverse cultures, and we've had to deal with the issue of diversity far more longer than many other former colonial administrations, because the colonizers didn't leave, they stayed behind. And there were other population groups like your Asians brought in, Malaysians brought in, and so forth. So we've had to deal with the issue of diversity in that sense for some time. And there were certain enclaves like the Western Cape where you would have even stronger and different traditions. On top of that, South Africa's anti-apartheid struggle was one of the most internationalized struggles ever in the human history. So because of our links to certain anti-apartheid movements across the world and exposure to some of these issues, then you had to understand that issue of different sexual orientation cannot be used as a Trojan horse or as a reason to exclude other people and as such. Of course, the issues of Black theology and liberation theology, due to South Africa's struggles being internationalized, we've had to look across the Atlantic. We've had to look at the liberation traditions in Latin America, in the Filipinos, and so forth, as we were coming up with our own Black theology in the country. So it's a combination of very complex confluence of factors that have created a particular tradition of understanding of certain things. It's the same way as in South Africa, you have a lot more acceptance of Muslims. No one roll their eye when you have a Muslim walking down this path and so forth. So that in itself is a consequence of those long evolved sociologies of diversity.
So, Madara, could you explain cogently what the agenda would be revamping the African traditions, as you said, to suggest that men dominate women in a particular way and that heterosexuality is acceptable and other forms of sexuality are unacceptable? Why would post-independence African leaders want to revamp African tradition in that way? What would their agenda be for doing that?
Remember that there is a nation-building project that comes, and many leaders have had to come up either with socialism, African humanism, and so forth. They're trying to reason about what chain was broken between that which was before colonialism and that which came after. Others do it sincerely, even though without the intellectual capacity to extract what historically was the case. And also understand that even customs have evolved. Even before colonialism, they were responding to the environment. It was not something that was cast in stone, frozen in a given point in time. But now, take Mobutu Sese Seko, for example. When he was trying to come up with what an African was, the African dress for civil servants and so forth. It was also because his own ideological stance within the Cold War aligned to the West and so forth. He didn't have much like the Nyereres of the Ujamaa, the counters of humanism, or the Nkrumahs and so forth. And he also didn't have your international perspective as well as the localized perspective of what being an African is. So when they revamp, they often extract things that will actually reinforce masculinity. Not that it was not there before, but simply in its brand new form. They use even the modern institutions, they extract from the church, from religion, from Catholicism, they extract from some of the colonial administrative laws, they extract whatever they can in the traditional customs, and they come up with a refurbished hybrid notion, which in their mind they say it's a puritanical African culture.
One of the big arguments of my book is the reason why this revamp is happening is because it's a way of defining yourself against a Western secular neocolonial culture. And one of the best ways of describing that Western secularized neocolonial culture, because of how big the gay movement is in places like London and New York, is to say, you know, we have these values in the African society, and this is what makes us different and unique, and this is how we're going to create the nation state against this assault of globalization. I wonder if you would agree with that, Somadoda, and then Tony, because of the work you've been doing at the UN Human Rights Commission, because I was so struck, Somadoda, by what you said in your opening comments about how this homophobic politics might be a result of a failure of globalization to be inclusive. So I'm going to ask you to address that. And then, Tony, I'm going to ask you to talk about that a little bit. Then I'm going to take a few questions because we've been given some, and then ask each of you to make a final comment.
The first thing I would say, if you look across the world, populism, and whether it's religious fundamentalism or is Islamic fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism, or is homophobic, reactions, are mainly as a result of a dominant Western system that has imprinted itself on what globalization is, which in essence, globalization didn't allow for diversity or plurality of identities. It came as a crude last crusade to bring the Western traditions through your phone, through your syllabus, through your everything. And that reaction now has created across the world, not only just sexual orientation, but in different cultural forms, in different political forms, reactions to it, some of which are quite extreme to say we're different from that, or reaction to digital mass, communication, which in essence is seen as not just communicating, but rather bringing Western values through the back door, without allowing other cultures, and in other levels, if you are French, you could say it's Anglicization. In other levels, if you are in the former colonies, you'd say now the Western imperial notions. So the reactions there, they are taking place at the time when you have no serious alternative, serious intellectual alternatives being explored as to what the world outlook would be like. And added to that, the fact that in the last 2-3 decades, globalization has enriched only the top 1% of the world, and people are still in immiseration, also has led to the failure of globalization, and therefore it being seen as the cause of all these problems. And it's lumped up with westernization in its form. Westernization, which doesn't celebrate that China once had ancient civilization, India had ancient civilization, Africa had ancient civilization, and therefore let's talk about the multiplicity of these or plurality of these contributing to human civilization. All what we hear is how the West is glorified in the main. Then you begin to have these streams reacting.
Okay. Thank you. Tony, would you like to add to that from your experiences lobbying at the United Nations on behalf of LGBTI inclusivity?
Thank you. I could not possibly have said it better than Somadoda said it. But what I do want to speak about is the work that we do. I'm an activist, not an academic. The work that we do at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, which is designed precisely to destabilize this opposition on the either side of the pink line, to destabilize that opposition that's been created by all of these forces that Somadoda has described, between faith and tradition and culture on the one hand, and this universalist human rights, secular Western frame on the other hand. Having identified that opposition, and as I said at the beginning, I do not believe that it's a true opposition. I think that it's a political tool, and the various reasons for its existence have been very well described. What we have decided is a part of the solution is to amplify the voices of queer people of faith from a multiplicity of global South contexts, people who embody in themselves the pink line, who bring into that space an embodied reality which destabilizes the opposition. Because doing so creates a space where it might be possible for people to be able to have conversations which are slightly less polarized.
Thank you.
And I think that really that is the only way out of this impasse, is for people to start talking to each other across the line. Because as long as we hold tightly to that split, I think we're all in trouble.
Thank you so much for that, Tony. I think my next book, if I do a sequel, is going to be called Destabilizing the Pink Line. And I really honor the way all of you in your work destabilize the pink line. We are running out of time. We only have 10 minutes left. We've had some wonderful questions. So with your permission, panelists, I'm going to select several of the questions we have, and I'm going to ask them all in one go. And I'm going to ask you in your final wrap-up comments to address any of those questions that you would wish to. Choose some or all of them, or ignore them entirely. And I really do hope that we can carry on this discussion in the various ways that we connect on social media. So riffing off just what you've said, Tony, the first question is from Selena, who says, I agree with Mark that this more deliberate challenge to the patriarchy is what can fuel the backlash seen against both LGBTQ movements and wider women's movements. How can stronger ideological and practical connections be made between these two movements, LGBTQ and women, which so often operate in silos? That might be a question, Jesse, if you heard the question, you might want to answer too. And then a similar question from Elizabeth. I've always thought that the notion of homophobia is used by colonizers to distract from addressing the real issue of decolonizing entrenched oppressive systems and structures. Can the panelists please comment? Tigile, there's a specific question to you from Siseko, who wants to know what you make of concepts such as inkonkoni, which have been used to refer to those who espouse same-sex desire. What are we to make of the way that there are nuanced and textured ways of explaining androgynous existence in traditional African cultures? Siseko, I'm summarizing your question. I hope I got it correct. Nikki's got a very specific question that I think is very cogent. What do panelists think about the rise of the pro-family movement hailing from the US and infiltrating the continent, promoting violent, anti-feminist, anti-gay agendas? And then finally, there's another question which circles around to the first question from an anonymous attendee. How does one address community outreach to increase LGBTI awareness, especially on experience gained from churches and Afrikaans churches who distance themselves from LGBT inclusivity? Tony, I'm going to ask you to go first, I'm going to ask you all to keep your answers quite brief, understanding that we're going to have more than enough time in ongoing discussions to explore this more deeply.
Thanks, Mark. I think that this is a giant discussion, and I would love to answer that one about religious fundamentalism, but I think that there isn't time. And I think because I haven't spoken about churches, and I think it's important also to speak about churches, I'm going to speak to the last question. So we do a lot of work in Southern Africa around dialogue with religious leaders. And we do it by running a program which capacitates LGBT people who are members of churches to be better able to engage in dialogue with religious leaders. And the key thing about that, I think, is that people encounter each other as human beings. Religious leaders are no longer in a position to say, this person is not one of my flock. And LGBT people, often for the first time, encounter that religious leader also as a human being. And that breaks down, in many respects, the kind of opposition, the hierarchy that's set up there. And it has the potential to change hearts and minds, and we are seeing it happening. Specifically, Lesotho, Botswana, we are seeing that shift happening. And I think my final word on the subject is that populism and the use of political homophobia only works, or populist use of political homophobia only works when the society in which you are doesn't understand well enough that queer people are people too.
Figile, I'm going to invite you to go next, and if you'd like to address that specific question from Siseko about Inkonkoni or speak more generally, up to you.
Thank you so much. I feel like singing. You know, there's a song that says, Inkonkoni, when we speak about Shoba, is something that we carry, which is a symbol of our ancestors. Siseko, really invoking the spirits there. And Inkonkoni also is similarly a term that is used in isiZulu to refer to people of the same sex. They are relations, absolutely. We are people of the spirit, and that is what I can say. And that is what is under attack. We are spiritual beings, and this is what colonization has done to us. And it's a pity that we keep on centering colonization when we should be moving away from it. But we need to remember. So that is exactly the issue, and we need to reclaim that. And I want to also just say quickly, the former president of Botswana, Festus Mogae, actually did admit to this. This is political propaganda. He said it openly in one of the conversations that when I was a president in Botswana and I was asked on the questions of sexual orientation and gender identity, there is no way I would have actually campaigned in that name because I needed to win votes. So at the end of the day, this is really about votes. And I think JC puts it well, even in Malawi, in Southern Africa, and in many other countries. Politicians and members of parliament, we are all politicians, we know this. We are asked to put this under the carpet. So I just want to say this. This is political propaganda. We need to resist it with the contempt that it deserves. And lastly, just to say thank you so much, Siseko, for invoking Ayiwomi. It's very important to remember Ayiwomi in the context of Kwame Nkrumah as well, and juxtapose the two in a sense that even Fanon and many other scholars, Patrice Lumumba, Thomas Sankara, and so on. But the point, Siseko, you are raising about Ayiwomi is how do we then contest these constructs? We need to remember colonization did not just dismember maleness. It dismembered also what it means to be a woman with a male and what spirit does. Spirit tells us that we are not gendered beings, we are not our genitals. So it's very, very important to remember that because it's at the center of patriarchy, what patriarchy has done to all of us in our bodies, in our spirit, and so on, and never to forget that we are spirit beings. Tony, you are so correct. This thing is not about the oppositions that are made to be. That is political propaganda that is making us to believe that. And at the center of this, remember Uganda, at the center of this, when the Christian fundamentalists have come into the continent, it is about money. Britain responded and said, if you do not finish this thing, we are going to stop giving you money. And this thing, when it does that, it complicates our lives even further, because it throws away the burden back to us to say we need to be fighting with our governments, to say the reason why Africa is getting poorer is because of these homosexuals in Africa. So it's political propaganda. We have to resist it. We have to get to the depth of it. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you so much, Vikita. Jesse, I'm going to see if we can get a clear line from you for a minute or two for you to respond and sum up in any way you would like to. And unmute yourself, please.
If you can hear me now.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I agree fully with Vicky. All of this is only political propaganda, but I think the capitalist mode we've brought in the neoliberalism has a lot to do with this. A lot of what is said be correct is what solves what actually will make them happy, what will make us have a GDP that we'll be happy about. The political correctness that and the question that says is pro-life this that is being pushed now in Malawi. When I was parliament member, we will see the Christian right from America actually give me to members of parliament to shoot down the LGBTI movement. And they're going to be why. I think the issue is there is an industry out there using homophobia to run government to make money. Bottom line, it is make sure they pay people so they can still buy yachts and stay in the expensive places because they believe in what they are saying. But they profit from that they are saying. Most of them, when you find them on time, they know LGBTQ right are right. But that is not what's going to feed the goose that lays the egg. So I think we need to understand that the dollarization of the state, the fact that people who are doing us and are doing it to make money from what they're doing, and the conversation between politicians and the corporate world, and are busy defining identities to the benefit of their pocket and make sure, because I'm telling you, there is a need between the pink and the politics, So to me, I need to understand that a lot of the propaganda we are seeing in industry that is, these are the people going to reduce in order for us to continue running America. Look at what Trump is doing. Look at the whole Israel thing that is going on now. We are in the middle of the termination of pregnant bill in Malawi. I should have seen the way the parliament stopped being place for self-delivery and governor and became a church. And then is why? Why? Because if they produce this homophobia, this patriarchy, it keeps the marketing mode in most of the country does not make surprises and does pander to small nuts. Wants the hegemonic discourses because that's where the cars bought, that's where the money is generated. So I think it's a link to an insatiable greed for money that is just, but they need to assure that it keep coming, and unfortunately it is dependent on a total abandon of people's truth and reality.
Jesse, I'm so sorry. I'm going to interrupt you because the line is so bad. And I'm really sorry you've had trouble connecting to us. If I could summarize what Jesse said as I was hearing it, and forgive me if I don't have this right, Jesse, is that homophobia is big business because of the evangelical right-wing churches in the United States that are funding so much of the pro-family movement on the continent. In a nutshell, that's what Jesse was saying and how that works in reality. Forgive me if I didn't summarize that efficiently enough, Jesse. So, my daughter, I'm going to ask you to respond to the questions or have any final comments that you would like to make.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. A pity that there is not enough time. The first one is to say, one of the questions was saying, Chapter 9 institutions in South Africa are often reactive instead of being proactive. Indeed, if we are to deal with the issues of prejudice, homophobia, and many others, a balance between what is law enforcement, but at the same time, what is public education becomes very important. But more fundamentally, as I started, we need to have a reflection on what alternative is there, for the current global system is not sustainable, not for environment, not for identities, not for trying to promote equity and so forth. For as long as the deep structural problems are there, you'll find many groups which will find refuge through these kinds of prejudice. And ultimately, there is a need also of a very careful way of how to tackle some of the challenges which are there, because sometimes you might be trying to solve one problem, then it creates another problem. For example, if the evangelicals come back saying we're pro-family, we do know that family is a very important institution. Therefore, there is a need to separate between the importance of a family and refining the family not to have any of the residues of being oppressive. From the notion of simply saying, either I'm a feminist or I am, a queer activist, family has no place at all. Because once you tackle the family directly in that fashion, many people understand the family as that primary base for them. The reaction will be, and it may look like they are supporting the pro-family, which is not the case. The evangelical pro-family agenda is different from the mainstream family notion of saying the collapse of a family leads to the collapse of a community, and therefore. So that very careful and neat strategizing in tackling some of the issues can blunt some of the backlash that often happens. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Somadoda. I'm actually going to end this webinar with a memory of an amazing speech that the former Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke made at one of the Art in Africa film festivals about 15 years ago. And it stuck with me forever. And it's exactly what you're describing, Somadoda. Because what he said is that one of the great things that the LGBT at that point movement has given political discourse in South Africa is an explicit understanding of something that all South Africans and all Africans know to be true, which is that the nuclear family is a myth. And that family means so many different things on our continent, in our cultures, in our experience, that families can be women-headed, that families can be 2 women-headed, families can be 3 women-headed, families can be intergenerational. Families are groups of people who are connected to each other by blood or by love and support each other. And it is that notion of family that is developed through the kind of pro-LGBTI advocacy that people like Fikile, Tony, and others practice, that politicians and academics such as Jesse support, and Somadoda too. It was really a very powerful and fascinating panel. I feel there are so many threads I would like to pull together and wind into a rope to make a pink line that can protect us all, rather than be used against us. But I think we need to let these threads remain kind of loose and untangled as we try and understand what these dynamics are and how we can best confront them and overcome them. And I hope that this discussion has given us all, those of us in the panel and those listening, some strategies and ideas for how to take our advocacy and our ideas forward. Thank you so much for joining us all. Thank you particularly to the Other Foundation for once more really being some kind of shining light in discussing these issues in the Southern African context. And goodbye, everyone. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody.